It's the first Distro Delve of the year and we're already 2 months in. Dang. In this one we're going to be looking at the very latest Manjaro with Gnome using the minimal ISO. Well, I was looking for a simple lightweight Linux distro for the old Terryza machine and someone recommended Manjaro Minimal, which I didn't actually know was a thing. And I've already looked at Manjaro with KDE back in the day, so let's give Gnome a try. If you're already familiar with it, Manjaro is an Arch-based Linux distribution. Its self-proclaimed focus is on user-friendliness, but I've always thought of it like a power user's distro. Manjaro often partners with hardware vendors, so there's usually pretty good hardware support, and the community and documentation is pretty massive. The primary difference between Manjaro and upstream Arch is in the repositories. See, Manjaro's stable packages are effectively Arch's packages, but they undergo a bit more testing and are typically behind a week or two. Manjaro also makes lots of tweaks here and there, which we'll see very shortly. I used the defaults for the Manjaro install and it took about 10 minutes on the Gigabyte Notabricks machine. And Manjaro has always had this cool welcome app, but it's a little bit odd that the Gnome welcome app starts in the foreground along with it. It's a good welcome app though, it's got a lot of well-organized stuff in there. So we can see that this is the Gnome desktop, but before we dig in, let's take a look at some of the resource specs. Disk usage was about 8 GB on a fresh install of the Gnome Minimal image. At idle, the available free memory was about 700 MB, and HTOP is showing around 78 tasks and 202 threads. The system load bounced around a bit before settling on about 3% at idle. And systemd said that the total startup time was about 26 seconds, which feels a bit long to me. Now this is Manjaro with Gnome 43.2, and there you go. I've officially looked at Gnome 43. I mean, it looks like Gnome. I don't really love how elementary the icons are becoming. The color scheme looks good, makes the desktop look great, but that's from Manjaro. It just looks and feels like regular old Gnome, except for the updater icon up there. The application list is a bit strange though. Everything is grouped into arbitrary folders, or seemingly arbitrary, except for the image viewer, video player, and music organizer. And things that I would expect to be a system tool, like, firmware updater, live in the accessories folder. Like, what? And in the way of backgrounds and things, there isn't much, but that's probably because we're using the minimal ISO, which probably didn't ship with them. Now, Manjaro has a couple of system tools besides the welcome app. There's the settings manager. It's the tool that lets you manage your kernel and driver versions. In a way, it's a tiny bit like OpenSUSE's Yast in that you can manage your users, time settings, locales, and stuff like that. There's also a little notification manager, which mainly seems to be for kernel upgrades and things of that nature. Manjaro also has a little updater applet, but the package manager itself is Pmac. Now I know that there's been some controversy around it due to the misconfigurations out of the box and things like that, but I actually really love Pmac. It's been a staple of Manjaro since forever, and I think that it's aged really well. There were only 2 updates for a freshly downloaded and installed system, and it's worth pointing out that the AUR is supported, but disabled by default. Now down in terminal land, we discover that NeoFetch is not pre-installed, so we must install it ourselves. Manjaro is based on Arch and so uses Pacman for managing packages. NeoFetch of course sports the famous Manjaro logo, and we can see that it's running a custom Manjaro kernel 6.1.11 and we're using Z Shell version 5.9. Now I don't have a lot of experience with C Shell, but I'm practically in love with Manjaro's configuration of it here. Manjaro ships with exFAT support out of the box, and the read speeds were good. Files mounts any device that is plugged in automatically, so if you insert an encrypted drive, it'll pop up immediately asking for your password, which is cool or annoying depending on how you look at it. And in the way of 4K video playback, the system did quite bad. Starting with the VP9 codec, which almost locked up the system, VP8 did quite a bit better, but the playback still wasn't great. And H.265 didn't really work at all. The CPU was peaked, but the video seemed like it was just paused. But I found out that Gnome has this really cool audio and video properties panel built in. It shows you all kinds of stuff. So I wanted to use this episode to get back to the original standard of Distro Delves series of tests. I like using Geekbench for tests because the binary is super portable and the tests are standardized, which report simple scores. There's single core and multi-core as well as Vulkan tests, so we run the gambit across compute and processing. The scores here are interesting, but without another distro to compare it to, they really don't mean a whole lot. Now I can say objectively that the user experience feels a bit sluggish. The animations were great, especially activities, even when you're gaming or something, but when I click to open something in settings, it just takes seconds to launch, and I don't know why it would because it's just the settings app. Now the performance in War Thunder was not really playable. The built-in benchmark returned about 13 frames a second, but in-game it was probably closer to about 9, and that was air combat, so tank combat probably isn't playable at all. And when I quit the match, the game actually crashed, so that's not a great sign. Now the benchmark in CSGO pulled in around 20 frames a second, but like War Thunder, it wasn't really playable live. Even when the graphics settings are on low, the in-game frame rate is just not playable. I still managed to hold the lead over these bots somehow though, so I guess that's an achievement. But overall, I'm actually pretty content with Manjaro. I really liked Gnome 42, but was concerned about the mobile-first approach that they were going, and now with Gnome 43, it's clear that they're doubling down on that route, and that's fine. There's really a lot to love about it, like it's great for a mobile, portable platform, but it's just not something I would run on my desktop or probably even my laptop. In terms of Manjaro's performance and general UX of things, I thought that it was pretty good, but there were a few things I'm taking note of. The video playback was really bad, but I suspect that that may have been due to Gnome videos just not being good with hardware acceleration. The performance in 3D games left something to be desired, but we'll see in future episodes if it's any better or worse on other distros, because I'm going to keep using this hardware. The custom tools like the kernel manager are cool, but the UI could really use some updating. And I love PMAC, but I did notice that neither Snap or Flatpak were installed by default, and I feel like they were in older versions of Manjaro. Now I know Manjaro isn't without its controversy, but in general I'd say that it is a pretty solid desktop-focused Arch-based distro. I hope you liked this Distro Delve, and if you did, be sure to leave a like, comment, subscribe. I actually really enjoyed writing this episode, and I hope you enjoyed it too. Until next time, see ya.